What if the dead could solve crimes? This audiobook takes you into the chilling world of real-life cases where psychics claim to speak with the murdered, uncover hidden clues, and reveal the darkest secrets no one else can see. Are you brave enough to confront the eerie truth that the dead may still be watching and talking? Chapter 1. The History of Psychic Crime Solving. Throughout the centuries, humanity has always sought answers in the darkest places, particularly when confronted with the chilling mysteries of unsolved crimes. When logic failed, when evidence was scarce, and when the guilty walked free, many turned to the supernatural for justice. Across the ancient world and into the modern era, oracles, seers, and psychics have been sought out to reveal what the dead knew but could not speak. The eerie history of psychic crime solving is filled with visions, ghostly whispers, and unsettling accuracy, making one question where the line between life and death truly lies. The idea of using psychic powers to solve crimes is not a modern phenomenon. It is as old as crime itself. In ancient Greece, the Delphic oracle was often consulted on matters of law and justice. Perched atop the sacred cliffs of Mount Parnassus, the oracle, believed to channel the god Apollo, would fall into a trance and offer cryptic answers to those seeking truth. These riddles often pointed to hidden culprits or long-buried secrets, guiding kings and generals toward decisions they might never have reached otherwise. In one recorded case, a thief had stolen treasures from a sacred temple, leaving no trace behind. Despite an exhaustive search by the authorities, the criminal remained elusive. Desperate, they turned to the oracle, who cryptically revealed that the thief was not far, but within the very temple grounds, disguised as a beggar. Sure enough, when the search resumed, the thief was found hiding in plain sight, exactly as foretold. The blending of the spiritual and the investigative was not only accepted but revered. In ancient Egypt, priests of the god Anubis were often called upon to consult the dead directly when crimes could not be solved by mortal means. These priests, skilled in rituals of mummification and the afterlife, were said to have the ability to commune with spirits. They were tasked with uncovering the truth behind murder and betrayal, using rituals that left many terrified. These practices blurred the line between justice and the supernatural, with the dead themselves becoming silent witnesses to their own murders. As history progressed, so too did the methods of psychic investigation. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the practice of scrying had emerged, using reflective surfaces like mirrors or bowls of water to divine hidden truths. Nostradamus, one of the most famous seers of this era, is said to have used a black mirror for such purposes. Although most known for his prophecies, some records suggest that he occasionally assisted in locating lost people or identifying perpetrators of heinous acts, drawing from the same pool of enigmatic visions that had made him famous. But it wasn't until the 19th century that psychic crime solving became widely known and utilized by law enforcement. In Victorian England, a time obsessed with the occult, clairvoyants and mediums often worked alongside detectives. The burgeoning field of spiritualism, which claimed to connect the living with the dead, found a ready audience among the desperate families of murder victims. After all, who better to speak for the dead than the dead themselves? In 1845, the infamous case of Maria Martin's murder in the Red Barn gripped England. Her stepmother, plagued by a series of vivid dreams, claimed to have seen Maria's ghost showing her the location of her body, buried under the floor of the barn. When authorities acted on this information, they discovered the young woman's remains in exactly the place the stepmother described. This was one of the earliest recorded instances where a supposed psychic vision led directly to the discovery of a murder victim, raising uneasy questions about how much the dead can truly reveal. As the 20th century dawned, psychic detectives became more entrenched in both folklore and reality. During the early 1900s, famous medium Florence Cook claimed to have received messages from victims of Jack the Ripper, though her revelations came too late to aid in the investigation. Nevertheless, the idea that victims could speak from beyond the grave took hold of the public imagination. In the 1950s, one of the first widely reported uses of a psychic in a modern police investigation occurred in the Netherlands. Dutch psychic Gerard Croiset was called upon to locate a missing girl. Croiset, known for his ability to visualize the locations of lost people, went into a trance and described the exact location where the child's body would be found. When police followed his detailed instructions, they discovered her remains near a canal, precisely where Croizet had envisioned. Croizet's abilities, honed through decades of practice, marked a significant turning point in psychic investigations. No longer were such practices confined to back-alley seances or whispered consultations. Now, psychics were sitting in police stations, consulted as legitimate aides to official investigations. His work led to a flurry of interest from police forces worldwide, and his methods, later dubbed remote viewing, became a central part of psychic investigations for decades. By the time the 1970s and 1980s arrived, psychic detectives had cemented their place in crime solving, particularly in the United States. High-profile psychics like Dorothy Allison, Sylvia Browne, and Noreen Renier became household names, their abilities feared and revered in equal measure. Allison, a self-taught psychic, became infamous for her accurate descriptions of crime scenes and her ability to point investigators in the right direction when leads ran cold. In the case of missing child Peter Quebec, Allison described details of his body's location, which were later corroborated when his remains were discovered in an area she had indicated. Remote viewing, too, became a cornerstone of psychic investigation. Governments around the world, including the U.S. military, began to fund research into this paranormal method, hoping that clairvoyance could pinpoint missing persons or reveal hidden threats. Though many of these programs were shrouded in secrecy, some of the results leaked, revealing that psychic methods were not only being used, but sometimes delivering unsettlingly precise information. In the shadows of police precincts, in the quiet moments after forensic teams have packed up and detectives have hit a dead end, there are whispers that perhaps, just maybe, the dead are not truly silent. Psychic detectives continue to blur the line between reality and the supernatural, leaving skeptics baffled and believers haunted by the possibility that the dead still speak. These individuals, tapping into something unseen and unknown, remind us that sometimes the answers to our darkest mysteries do not lie in the evidence, but in the ethereal realm just beyond our grasp. Chapter 2. Dorothy Allison, a psychic's uncanny accuracy. The story of Dorothy Allison unfolds like a chilling tale from beyond the grave. A suburban New Jersey housewife, ordinary by all appearances, who could see into the realm of the dead. Uninvited, dark visions of violence and death would come to her, filling her mind with haunting images of missing children and murder victims. Her psychic abilities made her a legend in the world of crime solving, feared by some, revered by others, and sought after by desperate families and police departments alike. What she saw in her mind's eye often led detectives to places they had scoured in vain, making them question whether something far more unsettling was at work in their investigations. Dorothy Allison wasn't always known as the psychic sleuth. She was, for most of her life, just another mother raising her children in Nutley, New Jersey. But from a young age, she knew something was different. She saw things, visions of tragedy, whispers of secrets long buried. Her first premonition came at the age of 14, when she foresaw the death of her own father in a car accident. The horrifying accuracy of her vision left her family rattled, and from that moment, Dorothy's life would be marked by an unsettling connection to death. As she grew older, the visions only intensified. She began helping neighbors and friends find lost items, but it wasn't until the 1960s that she would make a name for herself in the world of law enforcement. When local authorities were baffled by unsolved cases, they turned to Dorothy, whose name had quietly spread as someone who could provide help where all else had failed. But what made Dorothy stand out wasn't just her psychic ability. It was her frighteningly specific accuracy. Time and time again, Dorothy would offer information that no one else could have known, leading investigators to ask the unthinkable. Could she really be speaking with the dead? One of Dorothy Allison's most famous cases involved the disappearance of 11-year-old Tammy Leppard. It was a case that gripped the nation, a young girl who had vanished without a trace, leaving her family devastated and law enforcement stumped. The local police had hit dead ends, and with nowhere else to turn, they brought in Dorothy. What she revealed would send chills down the spines of those involved in the investigation. Dorothy arrived at the crime scene and immediately fell into a trance-like state, as if being drawn into another world. Her eyes glazed over, her voice dropped, and she began describing a location, an eerie, isolated place that police hadn't thought to search. She spoke of an abandoned building near water, the faint sound of traffic in the distance, and a sensation of fear so palpable that it unsettled even the most hardened detectives. She didn't just offer vague impressions. Dorothy gave street names, described landmarks, and even pointed to a specific direction that the search team should go. Investigators followed her guidance, combing the areas she had described. And while her clues didn't immediately lead them to Tammy, her chilling accuracy in pinpointing locations that had been overlooked gave law enforcement pause. How could she know such specific details about places she had never visited? How could a housewife, untrained in the art of investigation, see what seasoned detectives could not? While Tammy Leppert was never found alive, Dorothy's contributions to the case remain one of the most unsettling examples of her ability to tap into something beyond human understanding. The missing girl's fate remains a mystery, but Dorothy's eerie vision of her final moments continues to haunt the minds of those involved in the search. Perhaps even more chilling was Dorothy's involvement in the case of Paul Smith, a young boy who had been brutally murdered. This time, Dorothy's visions would lead not only to the body, but also to the identity of the killer. When the police called her in, they were desperate. Paul's family had been left shattered by the brutal crime, and the detectives had few leads to follow. But Dorothy, as always, saw more than anyone else could. She began by describing the location where Paul's body had been dumped, a lonely, wooded area just outside of town. She spoke of a clearing, a large tree that stood like a sentinel over the crime scene, and a discarded item that would confirm the boy's identity. Again, she gave specific details, down to the color of a nearby fence and the type of tree that marked the location. Police, half skeptical and half hopeful, followed her instructions, and to their astonishment, they found Paul's body in the exact spot Dorothy had described. But Dorothy's visions didn't stop there. She claimed to have seen the face of the killer in her mind's eye, a man with dark hair, a scar on his left cheek, and a habit of chewing gum nervously. She even described the man's vehicle, down to its make and model. Investigators, now shaken by Dorothy's accuracy in finding Paul's body, began to look for someone matching her description. Days later, a suspect was apprehended who matched Dorothy's vision almost perfectly. When confronted with the evidence, the man eventually confessed to the crime, leaving no doubt in the minds of the police that Dorothy had played an eerie and instrumental role in solving the case. Dorothy Allison's career as a psychic detective spanned decades, and her involvement in cases often left investigators deeply unsettled. Her accuracy, down to street names, physical descriptions, and precise locations, was uncanny. In many cases, her visions led directly to the discovery of victims' bodies, even when traditional police work had failed. Some of her most famous cases, like that of 13-year-old Jeanette De Palma, saw her describing landmarks near the crime scene with terrifying precision. Her fame grew as stories of her psychic prowess spread across the country. Families of missing persons would beg for her help, desperate to believe that the dead could still speak through her. And sometimes it seemed they did. Dorothy would often say that the dead weren't truly silent, that their spirits lingered, waiting for someone who could listen. And she listened. But what remains most unsettling about Dorothy's work is the question it leaves behind. How could she know these things? How could she, time and time again, lead police to places they had never thought to look? To many, Dorothy Allison was more than just a psychic. She was a bridge between the living and the dead, and her vision served as a chilling reminder that sometimes the dead have more to say than we are prepared to hear. Chapter 3. Noreen Renier, the psychic who stood with the FBI. The dead don't always rest easy. Some crimes leave behind echoes that resonate in ways the living can't comprehend. These echoes seem to hang in the air, attached to the very objects and places they touched. For most, these are just whispers lost in the void. But for Noreen Renier, these whispers took shape and spoke directly to her. Renier, a petite woman with an unassuming presence, became one of the few psychics in the world to be regularly consulted by the FBI. Her uncanny ability to read the energy of objects, known as psychometry, turned cold cases hot again and provided clues that even hardened investigators couldn't ignore. Noreen Renier's rise as a renowned psychic detective began in the 1970s, a time when the field of law enforcement still viewed psychics with skepticism, if not outright disdain. But Renier, with her focused intensity and unwavering belief in her abilities, quickly gained a reputation that law enforcement officials could not dismiss. Her psychic journey began quietly. She would handle personal objects, and upon touching them, she would receive vivid impressions, snapshots of events, feelings, even faces tied to the object's history. Over time, these flashes of insight became more focused, often guiding her to shocking revelations about past crimes and missing people. Soon, police departments across the United States began to take notice. Detectives, desperate and out of options, began to call Renier in when their cases went cold. However, it wasn't just local police who would be drawn to her skills. It was the FBI. One of Renier's most chilling cases involved the brutal murder of Kathleen Herzog. Herzog, a loving mother and respected community member, had disappeared without a trace, leaving her family devastated and law enforcement scrambling for answers. The local police, after exhausting all leads, turned to Renier as a last resort. When Renier arrived, she asked to hold personal items belonging to both Herzog and potential suspects. With Herzog's ring in her hand, Renier fell into a trance-like state, her face becoming pale as if she were reliving the woman's final moments. She described a dense forest, an area filled with rocks, and a feeling of dread that overwhelmed her. Then, she gasped, as if the life was being squeezed out of her. Herzog had been strangled. Renier was sure of it. And worse, she could see the killer's face. She described him in disturbing detail, a man with cruel, hard eyes, someone close to Herzog but filled with simmering rage. Renier also spoke of the location where the body could be found, mentioning specific physical landmarks that investigators recognized immediately. Her description of the crime scene was so specific, it matched places police had combed earlier without success. When they returned to the area Renier pinpointed, they found the remains of Kathleen Herzog. The location, the injuries, everything aligned with Renier's disturbing vision. Her insights had been disturbingly accurate. Local authorities were stunned, but her involvement didn't end there. As the investigation progressed, Renier's descriptions led to the apprehension of Herzog's killer, a man who had been close to the victim, just as Renier had described. Renier's abilities didn't go unnoticed by federal agencies either. When a case went cold or seemed unsolvable, she would sometimes receive a call from FBI agents desperate for any lead. One of the more chilling episodes in her career came when she was asked to provide insight into one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history, the Zodiac Killer. While Renier did not directly solve the case, her involvement offered unsettling glimpses into the mind of a killer who taunted law enforcement and the public for years. Using her psychometrist skills, Renier was given a piece of evidence from one of the Zodiac Killer's many taunting letters. Holding the object, she entered a state of deep concentration, her hands trembling as she described the killer's warped mentality. She spoke of the intense thrill he felt when his crimes were reported in the papers, the satisfaction he took in remaining just out of reach. Renier's insights painted a vivid psychological profile that added another layer of understanding to the baffling case. Renier's psychic talents were also called upon in the murder of Bruce Blackwood, a Florida businessman whose body was found in a remote field. Local authorities were struggling to make sense of the crime, and Renier was brought in once again. This time, she held Blackwood's wristwatch, the only item police had managed to recover from the crime scene. As she gripped the watch tightly, Renier began to speak of a man in a car, a man with dark intentions. She described the location in disturbing detail, the scent of freshly tilled soil, a nearby body of water, and the faint sound of a train in the distance. Investigators, guided by these eerie details, returned to the scene and uncovered evidence they had previously missed. Her readings helped police develop a clearer picture of Blackwood's final moments. As always, Renier's visions went beyond standard police work, leading to insights that haunted those who witnessed her process. Detectives who had worked on the case for months found themselves shaking their heads in disbelief. How could she know? By the 1980s, Renier had become one of the few psychics regularly consulted by the FBI. Her reputation as someone who could shed light on the most perplexing of cases made her a valuable, albeit unconventional, asset. Her methods were far from standard, and they made many within law enforcement uneasy. Yet, as FBI agents who had worked with her could attest, Renier's success was impossible to ignore. Retired FBI agent Robert Ressler, one of the pioneers of criminal profiling, once commented on Renier's involvement in investigations, stating that while the FBI doesn't publicly admit to using psychics, Renier's insights were often impossible to dismiss. In case after case, she would provide details that had never been released to the public, offering leads that would result in major breakthroughs. In one particularly disturbing case, Renier was asked to assist with a kidnapping investigation. As she held a personal item belonging to the victim, she was overcome with visions of a remote cabin surrounded by trees and a flowing river. Her description was so vivid that FBI agents were able to match it to a real location. When they arrived, they found the victim alive, but barely clinging to life. Noreen Renier's career as a psychic detective remains one of the most controversial and mysterious in history. Whether working on small-town murders or assisting the FBI in cases that defied explanation, Renier's ability to read the energy of objects and connect with the memories they held made her both a source of awe and fear. For those who witnessed her work firsthand, the experience left a lasting impression. FBI agents, detectives, and grieving families all found themselves grappling with the same unsettling question. How could she know so much? How could she see what others couldn't? Renier's legacy is one that straddles the line between the known and the unknown, leaving us to wonder if, perhaps, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved by mortal means alone. Chapter 4. Sylvia Browne, Psychic Hits and Misses in the Public Eye. The eerie voice of Sylvia Browne echoed through living rooms across America, her gravelly tone cutting through the quiet as she delivered chilling messages from the dead. A towering figure in the world of psychics, Browne captivated millions with her self-assured, no-nonsense style, appearing on talk shows like The Montel Williams Show and Larry King Live. With her sharp features and penetrating gaze, Browne spoke of the afterlife as though she had visited herself, weaving together tales of lost souls, cryptic warnings, and veiled prophecies. But beneath the veil of her certainty lurked an unsettling truth. Sylvia Browne's predictions were as infamous for their inaccuracy as they were for their seeming clairvoyance. Browne's career as a psychic spanned several decades, and during that time, she was often called upon to help with the most terrifying of cases: missing persons, unsolved murders, and families desperate for answers. In her appearances on television, she would offer solace to grieving mothers, panicked fathers, and communities living in fear. The spirits, she claimed, were speaking to her. Yet the question always hung in the air like a shadow. How much of what she said could be trusted? For every apparent success, there seemed to be a miss. One of her most infamous failures occurred during the disappearance of Amanda Berry, a case that would come to haunt Browne's legacy forever. On an episode of The Montel Williams Show in 2004, LaWanna Miller, the mother of Amanda Berry, appeared desperate for any shred of hope. Berry had vanished a year earlier, a 16-year-old girl who had simply disappeared while walking home from work in Cleveland, Ohio. Like so many other distraught families, Miller turned to Browne, hoping the famed psychic could provide answers the police had not. Browne, with her usual air of confidence, offered a prediction that sent a wave of devastation through the studio. She told Miller, with a bluntness that shocked the audience, "She's not alive, honey. Your daughter's not the kind who wouldn't call." Miller collapsed into sobs, her last sliver of hope cruelly extinguished by Browne's unwavering declaration. In the years that followed, Amanda Berry remained missing, her case slowly growing cold as the police ran out of leads and the public moved on. But in 2013, nearly a decade later, Amanda Berry reappeared alive. She had been held captive in a Cleveland house of horrors, mere miles from where she had vanished. The world gasped in shock at her miraculous escape, but for Sylvia Browne, the revelation was a stunning and public failure. Browne's prediction of Berry's death had been entirely wrong, and worse yet, it had left a grieving mother with nothing but despair in her final years. Lawana Miller had died in 2006, never knowing that her daughter was still alive. The chilling nature of Browne's mistake reverberated through the psychic community, but Browne herself remained unfazed. She claimed that while her predictions might not always align with reality, the spirit world was a murky place, and communication from the dead was never perfect. It was a defense she would lean on time and again, but the public was left to wonder. If Browne could be wrong about something so vital, how many other families had been led astray by her words? Amanda Berry's case wasn't the only instance where Browne's predictions about missing persons or deaths went tragically wrong. In 2002, Browne told the parents of Sean Hornbeck, a Missouri boy who had disappeared, that their son had been killed by a dark-skinned man with dreadlocks. This grim prediction led the family to believe their son was dead. But like Amanda Berry, Hornbeck was found alive in 2007, having been held captive for over 4 years by a man who looked nothing like Browne's description. In 1999, Browne told the family of Opal Jo Jennings, a 6-year-old girl abducted in Texas, that she had been sold into slavery in Japan. In reality, Jennings had been murdered shortly after her abduction, her body discovered less than a year after Browne's erroneous prediction. These missteps sent shivers down the spines of skeptics, raising uncomfortable questions about the ethical ramifications of Browne's so-called psychic insights. Yet, despite these high-profile blunders, there were instances that seemed to validate Browne's claims, moments when her predictions hit so close to the mark that even the most skeptical were forced to reconsider. Browne's supporters clung to these cases as proof that her abilities were real, even if imperfect. One such case involved the 1993 disappearance of Holly Crewson, a California teenager who vanished under mysterious circumstances. Browne told Crewson's family that their daughter had been murdered and that her body would be found near water. Crewson's remains were discovered in 2006, over a decade later, buried near a riverbank, just as Browne had predicted. To her believers, this was evidence of Browne's connection to the spiritual realm. Another chilling example was the case of Melinda Morales, a missing woman from Florida. Browne predicted that Morales had been killed and that her body would be found near a railroad. Months later, Morales's remains were located near a set of train tracks, eerily confirming Browne's vision. These cases, though fewer in number, added a haunting legitimacy to Browne's career, leaving the public divided between believers and skeptics. Browne often defended her methods by emphasizing the complexities of communicating with the spiritual realm. In her numerous books and public appearances, she explained that the dead do not always speak clearly. The information they provide is fragmented, cloaked in symbols and emotions rather than concrete facts. According to Browne, this is why some predictions could be uncannily accurate, while others appeared horribly wrong. Yet even her own explanations carried an unsettling weight. The idea that the dead could reach out to the living, offering vague and incomplete messages, was terrifying in its implications. If Browne was right, then every missing child, every unsolved murder, had spirits hovering just beyond the veil, trying to be heard, but not always succeeding. It was a notion that left families trapped in a liminal space, uncertain whether to believe in hope or to accept the finality of death. As Browne's career continued, the dichotomy between her successes and failures grew starker. While some families found comfort in her words, others were left with only heartache and confusion. The shadows she cast over her predictions never quite lifted, and by the time of her death in 2013, Browne's legacy was one of chilling uncertainty. In the end, Sylvia Browne's career as a psychic who claimed to communicate with the dead left behind a trail of terror and wonder. Whether one viewed her as a gifted medium or a purveyor of false hope, her impact on the world of psychic crime-solving was undeniable. The dead, it seemed, had spoken through her, but whether they told the truth remained a mystery. Chapter 5. Pam Coronado, Finding the Missing with Psychic Visions. Pam Coronado's story begins in the murky twilight between belief and skepticism, a place where the ordinary rules of reality bend, and the veil between the living and the dead grows thin. She never set out to be a psychic detective. A single mother from California, Pam's life was anything but extraordinary, until one fateful night in 1996, when a vivid, unsettling dream changed everything. In her sleep, she found herself walking through an unfamiliar landscape, an open desert where the air seemed heavy with the weight of something terrible. She followed the pull of an invisible force until, in her dream, she stumbled upon a lifeless body. It was the missing woman she had heard about in the news, Linda Sobuk, a model who had vanished days before. That dream set Pam Coronado on a path from which there would be no return. The next day, after reporting the dream to law enforcement, she would later learn that Sobuk's body was found in a desert area, just as Pam had seen. For many, this would have been a terrifying coincidence, but for Pam, it was an awakening. She realized that she had tapped into something far beyond her comprehension, something that both terrified and compelled her. It was as if the missing and the dead had begun speaking to her, reaching out through the darkness of their final moments, their desperation pulling her into the shadowy world of unsolved mysteries. One of Pam Coronado's most haunting cases came in 1993, when Holly Crewson disappeared under mysterious circumstances. By the time Pam was called in to help, years had passed, and hope had all but faded. The case had gone cold, the trail long since gone dark. But Pam, with her unnerving ability to channel psychic visions, felt a tug that she could not ignore. She immersed herself in the case, allowing herself to be consumed by the images that flooded her mind. Pam's visions were not always clear. Sometimes they were flashes of disjointed scenes, cryptic symbols, or strange sounds. But in Holly Crewson's case, she saw something unmistakable: water. She felt a powerful pull toward a body of water, and the image of a river surfaced repeatedly in her mind. There, in the deep recesses of her psychic impression, Pam saw the unthinkable: Holly's lifeless form, hidden away, waiting to be found. This was no ordinary vision. It was a dark and twisted connection to the final moments of a soul lost in violence. With a conviction that sent chills down the spines of the investigators, Pam relayed what she had seen to law enforcement. And though they had their doubts, they followed her lead. Eventually, Holly's remains were discovered buried near a riverbank, exactly where Pam's visions had led them. The case, which had seemed destined to remain unsolved, was cracked open by the psychic detective's chilling insight. For some, it was a miracle. For others, it was a terrifying glimpse into the unexplainable, where the line between the living and the dead was thinner than they had ever imagined. The Holly Crewson case was far from the only time Pam Coronado's psychic abilities guided investigators to crucial discoveries. Pam's visions were often disturbingly specific, cutting through the clutter of police work to pinpoint details no one else could have known. In one case, a family had been desperately searching for a missing loved one, and Pam had been brought in to consult. As soon as she touched an object connected to the missing person, a deluge of images hit her: a rural area, a dirt road, a distinctive tree. The investigators were skeptical, but they followed Pam's lead, and after searching the area she described, they discovered the body of the missing person, buried beneath a tree, just as Pam had seen. It was as though Pam had walked through the crime scene in real time, guided by forces no one could see but her. Pam's method, often referred to as remote viewing or psychic impressions, was both simple and terrifying. She didn't need to visit the crime scene. She only needed a connection, a photograph, a piece of clothing, anything that had been touched by the person in question. Once she held the object, the energy of the victim or even the perpetrator would flood her mind, showing her what had happened with an eerie clarity. Time after time, Pam's visions led detectives to evidence they never would have found on their own, as though she was peeling back the layers of the physical world to glimpse what lay hidden beneath. Over the years, many law enforcement officers who worked with Pam have come forward to speak about their experiences, and their words offer a chilling validation of her psychic abilities. One detective, who had long been skeptical of psychic detectives, recalled a case in which Pam had been called in to assist. The investigation had stalled, with no leads, no clues, and no suspects. Pam was given an object connected to the victim and, after holding it for a few moments, began describing a location in detail, an old building, overgrown with vines, hidden away in the woods. The detective, unwilling to ignore any possible lead, followed Pam's description. What they found was nothing short of shocking. In the exact place Pam had described, they uncovered the body of the victim, hidden in the decrepit remains of the building. The detective later admitted that Pam's vision had been the key to solving the case, despite all his initial skepticism. "It's not something I can explain," he said, "but I know what we found, and I know we wouldn't have found it without her." Other detectives have shared similar stories, each one more unnerving than the last. Some claim that Pam's psychic impressions gave them crucial details about the suspects, descriptions of faces, clothing, even the make and model of their vehicles. One officer recounted a case where Pam had accurately described the suspect's home, down to the color of the door and the layout of the rooms inside. When the suspect was finally apprehended, everything Pam had seen matched perfectly. But Pam's work isn't without its toll. The psychic visions she experiences are often harrowing, filled with the agony and fear of the victims whose final moments she relives. She has spoken publicly about the emotional burden of her abilities, describing how the images haunt her long after the case has been solved. The dead, it seems, are never far from her mind. For those who believe in Pam's abilities, her work stands as a beacon of hope in the darkest of times. But for the skeptics, her gift raises far more questions than answers. How can someone tap into the energies of the missing and the dead? Is it truly possible to see beyond the veil, to walk through the shadows of the past and uncover the truth? Pam Coronado's story is one that straddles the line between the living and the dead, leaving us to wonder, how much do we really understand about the mysteries of this world? And how many more secrets lie just out of reach, waiting for someone like Pam to reveal them? Chapter 6. Historical Use of Psychics in Law Enforcement. The dimly lit chambers of history are filled with whispers of crimes unsolved, injustices left to fester, and souls wandering, seeking closure from beyond the grave. Long before the rise of forensic science, when the world still clung to the mysticism of the unknown, law enforcement agencies turned to a different kind of guide: psychics, mediums, and clairvoyants. Their services were often sought when the trail ran cold, when the facts refused to align, and when the dead themselves seemed to demand justice. One of the earliest and most chilling examples of psychic intervention in criminal investigations comes from 19th century Europe, a time when seers and mediums still held sway over the public imagination. In Paris, the infamous case of Jacques Saint-Germain, a wealthy and eccentric nobleman, became a symbol of the occult's dark involvement in justice. Saint-Germain was rumored to possess knowledge far beyond his years, with whispers claiming he was immortal. He was linked to a string of grisly murders, the victims drained of blood, their bodies left in grotesque positions as if they had been part of some sinister ritual. When traditional investigation methods failed to uncover the murderer, authorities turned to a clairvoyant named Madame Dubois. Desperate, they hoped she could provide insight into the case. Madame Dubois, known for her eerie connection with the spirit world, performed a seance to communicate with the murdered souls. What transpired in the seance chamber was beyond anything the officers had expected. The seance was cold and thick with tension, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that danced ominously against the walls. As Madame Dubois channeled the spirits, she described visions of blood, a man cloaked in shadows, and a location near the Seine River. Though her words were cryptic, the description of the suspect matched Jacques Saint-Germain's estate in unsettling detail. Following her lead, the authorities discovered damning evidence in Saint-Germain's home, a collection of vials containing what was believed to be human blood. Though he was never captured, Saint-Germain fled Paris and was never seen again. Some believe he still roams the earth, his name forever linked to the mysteries that surround his disappearance. The use of psychics to solve crimes extends far beyond Europe. In ancient Egypt, justice was often seen as a divine matter, guided by the hand of the gods. Pharaohs and their courts would consult priests, oracles, and magicians to gain insight into matters of life and death. These spiritual figures acted as intermediaries between the mortal realm and the gods, interpreting omens, dreams, and the signs from the afterlife to ensure that justice was served. One of the most notorious cases involved the assassination of Pharaoh Ramesses III. Historical records, including the Harris Papyrus, detail a plot led by one of his secondary wives to overthrow him. After the king's death, his court called upon priests who performed elaborate rituals to communicate with the gods, seeking their guidance in uncovering the conspirators. The priests used divination techniques and interpreted the dreams of those involved to determine the guilt of the accused. Although these methods may seem mystical today, they were an integral part of the legal system at the time, and the conspirators were eventually sentenced to death based on the evidence provided by the divine messages. The Egyptian belief in the afterlife meant that the spirits of the dead could influence the living, and crimes against the state or the pharaoh were seen as offenses against the gods themselves. This belief ensured that spiritual insight played a key role in the legal process, blurring the lines between the judicial and the supernatural. In ancient China, the influence of the supernatural on legal matters was equally pervasive. It was not uncommon for the living to turn to mediums or spirit communicators when investigating crimes, particularly murder. The Chinese believed that the spirits of the wronged dead could return to haunt the living, seeking retribution for the injustices they suffered. One of the most chilling historical accounts comes from the Han Dynasty, where the spirits of murder victims were believed to provide clues to their killers. In one notable case, the ghost of a murdered official appeared in the dreams of his family members, detailing the circumstances of his death and identifying his killer. The family, convinced by the vividness of the dreams, approached local authorities, who re-examined the case and discovered that the dream's details matched overlooked evidence. The murderer was eventually apprehended, and justice was served, all due to the victim's restless spirit guiding the living from beyond the grave. This intertwining of the spiritual and the judicial was not limited to dreams. In some cases, mediums would be called upon to channel the spirits of the deceased, asking them directly for clues or confessions from the guilty. These sessions, often held in secret, were conducted with great reverence and fear, as the belief in the power of the afterlife was profound and ever-present. As the centuries passed and science began to take precedence in law enforcement, the role of psychics in criminal investigations diminished but never disappeared. The historical precedents set by the ancient Egyptians, Chinese, and later European societies had already paved the way for modern psychic detectives. Their influence can still be felt in law enforcement today, though often hidden in the shadows where skepticism and belief clash. One of the most famous early modern cases of psychic involvement occurred in 1929 when a well-known British medium, Estelle Roberts, was consulted by Scotland Yard to assist in the search for a missing girl. Roberts claimed to have seen the girl in a vision, describing her location with such eerie precision that the police were able to narrow their search. Though her body was eventually found, too much time had passed to save her, but the accuracy of Roberts' vision left investigators with chills. It was as if the girl's spirit had reached out through the medium, crying for help, though it was already too late. As the modern era progressed, law enforcement agencies around the globe have remained divided on the role of psychics. While many reject their involvement, deeming it unscientific and unreliable, others have found themselves reluctantly turning to psychic guidance when all else fails. From the seances of 19th-century Europe to the spirit channeling of ancient Egypt and China, the history of psychic involvement in crime-solving is one of uneasy alliances between the living and the dead. Though their methods may seem shrouded in darkness, the fact remains that for centuries, psychics have guided the hands of justice when reason and evidence have faltered. The cases that follow would not have been solved without their eerie interventions. Today, these psychic investigators walk in the shadowy footsteps of their predecessors, still daring to reach beyond the grave to solve the unsolvable. Chapter 7. Real-life testimonies, families and detectives who believe. The world of crime solving is one dominated by cold facts, hard evidence, and logical deduction. Yet, in the darkest hours, when every lead has been exhausted and hope seems lost, some turn to a different kind of expertise, a connection with the spiritual world. Throughout history, psychic detectives have been sought out by both grieving families and desperate investigators. Their stories, filled with eerie accuracy and inexplicable detail, have left even the most hardened skeptics questioning the limits of their understanding. Detective Robert J. Stone worked for over 2 decades in law enforcement, building his career on evidence, facts, and the concrete certainty that science brings. But one case would shake his foundations of belief, leaving him grappling with forces far beyond his control. In the early 1990s, Stone was assigned to a missing person case in rural Pennsylvania. Despite a thorough investigation, no clues surfaced, and the victim's family grew increasingly desperate. With nowhere else to turn, the family consulted a well-known psychic in the area. Stone, skeptical and even slightly offended at the suggestion, attended the session only to appease the family. What happened next was something he would never forget. The psychic described the missing woman's location in vivid, unsettling detail, right down to a rusted sign near an abandoned well and the distinct smell of damp earth. Stone's skepticism wavered as these details matched the area he had been investigating, locations she couldn't have known about. Days later, the woman's body was discovered, just as the psychic had predicted. Stone would later testify to the accuracy of the psychic's visions, admitting that although he couldn't explain it, he could no longer deny the reality of what he had seen. For many families, the grief of losing a loved one under mysterious circumstances can be unbearable. This was the case for Patricia O'Brien, whose 17-year-old daughter, Ellen, disappeared one summer evening in 2001. Months passed without any leads, and Patricia's life spiraled into a living nightmare of unanswered questions. The local police had done everything they could, but the case was stone cold. Patricia turned to a psychic out of sheer desperation. She had always been a rational woman, dismissing the paranormal as fantasy. But her maternal instincts drove her to grasp at anything that could bring her daughter home. The psychic, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, closed her eyes and held Ellen's photograph. Slowly, she began to describe a location, an overgrown path, a hidden creek, and a place where the trees leaned together as if whispering secrets. The details were so specific, so eerily vivid, that Patricia and a few detectives decided to visit the area, despite their doubts. It was exactly as the psychic had described. Beneath the mossy earth, Ellen's remains were found. Patricia collapsed to the ground, sobbing with grief, but also with a strange, twisted sense of relief. She had her answer. Though her daughter was gone, the dead had spoken. In 1985, a 7-year-old boy named Timmy Dugan disappeared from his home in California. Local police scoured the area, questioned neighbors, and followed every possible lead, but days turned into weeks without any sign of the boy. The town buzzed with fear and suspicion, while Timmy's parents lived in a state of suspended agony. Detective Lisa Howard was a no-nonsense investigator who prided herself on never needing outside help. But after exhausting all possibilities, the boy's parents brought in a psychic, an old man who had helped police in several other cases. Howard went along with it reluctantly, convinced it would lead nowhere. The psychic held Timmy's favorite toy, a small red truck, in his hands. He closed his eyes and described water, a body of water surrounded by trees, a place where the wind always seemed to be howling. Howard took note but brushed it off, thinking it was too vague to be of use. However, the next day, she received a tip from a nearby county. A fisherman had found the boy's jacket near a lake that matched the psychic's description. When Timmy's body was recovered from the lake's cold depths, Detective Howard was shaken to her core. She had heard about psychic detectives, but to witness it firsthand, to see how closely the psychic's vision aligned with reality, was something she would carry with her for the rest of her career. For Frank Matthews, the murder of his son, Brian, was a wound that time could never heal. Brian had been the victim of a brutal robbery gone wrong, and although the killer was convicted, many questions remained unanswered. Frank was left haunted by the absence of details, particularly why his son had been targeted and what had truly happened in his final moments. Years after the trial, Frank met with a psychic named Janine, who specialized in connecting with the dead. Frank was hesitant. He had never believed in such things, but his grief was too great to ignore the possibility of closure. When Janine spoke, she did not tell him what he wanted to hear. Instead, she described Brian's final moments in terrifying clarity, his fear, his confusion, and finally, his acceptance. She even described an item that had been taken from Brian that the police had never recovered, a silver watch his grandmother had given him. Later, Frank spoke with the police, who confirmed that a watch had indeed been stolen but never found. It was a small detail, but it gave Frank a sense of peace that nothing else had. Through Janine, Frank felt as though his son had reached out to him, offering some semblance of closure from beyond the grave. For families and detectives alike, psychic involvement in criminal investigations remains a controversial and emotionally charged subject. Yet, time and time again, those who have witnessed the seemingly inexplicable accuracy of these visions are left questioning the boundaries between life and death, between the seen and unseen. In moments of sheer desperation, when all traditional methods fail, many still find solace in turning to psychics. It is not always about believing in the supernatural, but about the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the spirits of the dead still linger, offering answers, guiding hands, and whispering truths from the other side. As we delve into the unsettling realm of psychic detectives, we invite you to reflect on your own beliefs. Have you ever experienced something inexplicable that made you question the boundaries between life and death? We want to hear your stories. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Together, let's explore the mysteries that connect us to the unseen world. Don't forget to share this journey with others who might have their own chilling encounters.